All right, we are going to pick up now with operant conditioning. So, if when we were talking about classical conditioning, and classical conditioning has to do with involuntary behaviors, operant conditioning is when we're talking about voluntary behaviors. Okay, operant conditioning involves adjusting the consequences of our behaviors so that we can easily learn to do more of what works and less of what doesn't work. So, for instance, we may smile more at work after this repeatedly gets us bigger tips. We learn how to ride a bike using strategies that don't make us crash. Okay, how it works. An act of a chosen behavior, a response, is followed by a reward or punitive feedback from the environment. The results? Well, the reinforced behavior is more likely to be tried again. Punished behavior is less likely to be chosen in the future. So, for instance, if we look at our seal friend here, you know, the response, they balanced a ball. They bounced the ball on the nose. What happened? They got a fish. So what do they do again? They balanced the ball because they wanted more fish. So operant and classical conditioning are different forms of associate learning. Remember, in classical conditioning, it involves respondent behavior, reflexive, automatic reactions such as fears or cravings. Okay, these reactions to unconditioned stimulus become associated with a neutral, which then becomes the conditioned stimulus. In operant conditioning, okay, that involves operant behavior, chosen behaviors which operate on the environment. These behaviors become associated with the consequences with punish, decrease, or reinforce, increase the operant behavior. Okay, there is a contrast in the process of this conditioning. Okay, in classical conditioning, the experimental or neutral stimulus repeatedly precedes the respondent behavior and eventually triggers the behavior. So in classical conditioning, the stimulus comes before the behavior. In operant conditioning, the stimulus follows the behavior. Okay, so you have to do the thing that they want you to do before you get reinforced or punished. Okay, so in classical conditioning, okay, it precedes, okay, it comes before, and then in operant conditioning, the reward comes after. So B.F. Skinner, who was our kind of the pioneer of all of this operant conditioning stuff, trained pigeons to play ping pong like we did, like we saw in class, and guide a video game missile. Okay, and he saw potential for exploring and using a guy named Edward Thorndike's principle much more broadly. He wondered, how can we more carefully measure the effect of consequences on chosen behavior? Now, Edward Thorndike's principle was kind of mind-blowing, and basically he said if people, he kind of called it the law of effect is what it's called. So Thorndike and the law of effect, basically what he said is that if people like something, they will keep doing it. If people don't like doing something, they will stop doing it. And he studied this a lot on cats. But so Skinner though took it the next step. He said, what else can creatures be taught to do by controlling the consequences? What happens when we change the timing of the reinforcement? So he took Thorndike's very basic principle and he expanded it and really changed the front of psychology. So one of the ways he did this is he created what was called the operant chamber. Okay, so B.F. Skinner, like Ian Pavlov, pioneered more controlled methods of studying conditioning. So the operant chamber, which is sometimes called the Skinner box. So if you hear the term the Skinner box, this is kind of what it's called, what it's referring to, this operant chamber, allowed detailed tracking of rates of behavior change in response to different rates of reinforcement. Okay, so it looked something like this. There was usually, some food and water dispenser, there was a bar, there was a light, and there was a speaker, and he would have different things that would have to happen in order for the animal, the rat or pigeon, to get the food or to get the water. Okay, so he did use hunger kind of as the primary motivator for the animals, and he was able to get them to do all kinds of things just based off of this reward that they got of food and water. So what is reinforcement? Again, we talked about reinforcement a little bit, but reinforcement refers to any feedback from the environment that makes a behavior more likely to reoccur. Okay, so the key thing with reinforcement is that you are increasing behavior. Okay, now there's two subtypes of reinforcement, or two types of reinforcement that we talk about. The first one is positive reinforcement. This means that you are adding something desirable to get somebody to increase their behavior. The key thing here you really have to remember with positive and negative reinforcement is that we're not necessarily talking about good and bad. You have to kind of wipe positive, positive good, negative bad from and go to more of a mathematical reference. Positive meaning adding. So with positive reinforcement, we are adding something desirable. Okay. With negative reinforcement, we are taking away, we are ending something unpleasant. Okay, so positive reinforcement is adding something positive to the person to get them, or to the subject to get them to increase their behavior. Negative reinforcement would be taking away an undesirable, a negative stimulus, a bad thing, okay, to get them to continue their behavior or to increase their behavior. Okay, so for instance, this meat rat has just completed the task out in the cold. So he came up and he warmed his belly because this is obviously positive reinforcement. Okay, because he's coming up and he's saying, nice warm belly, no more cold. Okay, so for the meat rat, this warm light is desirable. Now, the cycle of mutual reinforcement. One of the really important things to remember with operant conditioning is that it doesn't matter what you think is a reinforcer or a punishment. It matters what the person that you are trying to condition thinks. Okay, and this is none more evident than children. So children who have temper tantrums when they are frustrated may get positively reinforced to this behavior when parents occasionally respond by giving in to the child's demand. The result, well, they're stronger and more frequent tantrums. Parents who occasionally give in to tantrums may get negatively reinforced when the child responds by ending the tantrum. So see, now here both parties are being conditioned. The child, right, has a tantrum, get what he wants. So what does that do? Well, that's a positive reinforcer so that the child continues to have tantrums because it gets what it wants. Now, the parents, though, okay, are being negatively reinforced because when the kid gets what it wants, okay, what happens? The tantrum stops. So the stopping behavior is increasing when you're giving the child what it wants. So the parent is being negatively reinforced to keep giving the child and keep giving it. So again, sometimes we can kind of have this mutual reinforcement that's happening. Okay. Now, discrimination is something that occurs, we talked about it in classical conditioning, but it also happens in operant conditioning as well. So discrimination refers to the ability to become more and more specific in what situations trigger a response. Okay, so this is when we use something called shaping. Okay, so shaping is a term you need to make sure you know. So shaping can increase discrimination if reinforcement only comes for certain discriminative stimuli. Okay, for example, rats, dogs, and even spiders can be trained to search for very specific smells from drugs to explosives. So what we do is we teach them how to discriminate and pick out of all the similar smells only that one particular stimuli that they're looking for. Okay, pigeons, seals, and manatees have been trained to respond to specific shapes, colors, and categories. So discrimination, like we kind of talked about in classical conditioning, is this idea that you will only be reinforced for a very, very specific behavior. So we're going to end here for part 1 of operant conditioning, and the next part we're going to go into schedules of reinforcement.